The election of 1824 is a really interesting election because the United States is changing at this point. So we're now going to be entering the age of the common man. And a lot of things are changing, but especially the ability to vote is important in this election. So prior to this election, you really need to have a lot of land and a lot of money and be a white male in order to cast your vote for president. So this is going to leave out a lot of the population of the United States. But with the election of 1824, the ability to vote becomes more widespread for white men. So now you don't need to have all this land and all this money. You just need to be a white man in order to vote. So this is going to include a lot more of the average, everyday, Joe Schmo type people that weren't able to vote before. So this is going to change this election a lot. So now let's go over your four candidates. So this is interesting also because the four candidates who run, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay, they're all running under one political party. Because remember, at this point, there's only one political party, and that's the Democratic Republican Party. So you're going to have four very famous political figures all running underneath one political party, and this is going to be a crazy concept. And the results are going to show just how crazy this is. So Andrew Jackson has the most electoral votes with 99, Adams has 84 electoral votes, Crawford with 41 electoral votes, and Clay with 37 electoral votes. And the fact that this election is so close is really what's going to decide how insane this election is going to end up. Because if we look at the map to the right here, you're going to see sectionalism has a big part in who wins. So what parts of the country believe what, and what parts of the country want who as their president. So you're going to see Adams more in the north. The more industrial, wealthy north is going to want Adams. More of the south is going to want Andrew Jackson. More of the west with Henry Clay, and so on and so forth. So sectionalism is going to decide it. But although, different parts of the country voted for different people and the majority voted for Jackson, that doesn't matter because Andrew Jackson didn't win the majority of the vote. He won the most, but he didn't win over 50% of the vote. So because of this, now we need to go to the 12th Amendment. So 12th Amendment of the United States says that basically if an election is undecided, it needs to go to the House of Representatives and the House needs to decide who wins. And this is where the election gets really sketchy because the vote goes to the House of Representatives and Henry Clay, he comes in last, so he no longer is in the running, and he is the Speaker of the House, so he has a lot of say, and he sways the House of Representatives to vote for John Quincy Adams as president. And this is going to be a big deal because John Quincy Adams is going to win the presidency, although he doesn't have the most electoral votes or the most popular votes. And Jackson and his followers are going to be furious at this. They're going to say that this was corrupt. They're going to say that Adams promised Clay something in order for him to do this. And this is going to lead to something called the corrupt bargain, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But the results of this election are going to be really shady, and it's going to lead to a very rocky presidency for John Quincy Adams. After the messy election of 1824, John Quincy Adams would go on to become the sixth president, and this really wasn't an easy presidency for him. He would even go on to say, the four most miserable years of my life were my 4 years in the presidency. So that should really say a lot. There were a few reasons why this wasn't an easy term for him. So first things first, he was a lot like his dad, John Adams. John Adams was known to be stuck in his ways. He was really stubborn and unable to compromise, and John Quincy Adams was really the same sort of person, and this was going to make his presidency really difficult. And also, during his term in office, he was really plagued by this corrupt bargain scandal. It was like this dark cloud hanging over his head, and it was really stuck with him from the second he stepped into the White House to the second he left the White House, and it made a lot of the American people distrust him. And also, at the end of his presidency, he passed the Tariff of 1828, or what the angry Southerners like to call the Tariff of Abominations. And what this did was it hiked up the prices of the tariffs a lot. And this was to protect the industry of the United States. But it ended up hurting the South and helping the North. So basically, the North, this would protect their industry, would help their economy, but the South got a lot of their goods from outside of the country, from other places such as England, and this would make it so they had to pay a lot of money to get these goods. So this would really wreck the South and help the North and add to this issue of sectionalism that was already boiling over in the country. So as we can tell, his presidency was definitely a difficult one. But outside of this, he had a really successful political career. So after his presidency was over, he decided to do what no president has done before, and he ran for the House of Representatives. And he kind of kicked butt there. So he was an awesome congressman. He was a brilliant abolitionist. He was really focused on important issues like getting rid of slavery. So he was an awesome congressman, he was an awesome politician, but as a president, not so much. But everything else, he was a really successful, intelligent guy. If we thought the election of 1824 was nasty, then we haven't seen anything yet, because the election of 1828 is even worse. So this election is the rematch that Andrew Jackson could have dreamed of. This was complete revenge on John Quincy Adams, and we're going to go into detail on why that is, but first, let's go over the nuts and bolts of this election. So in this election, you're going to see Andrew Jackson, who's a Democrat, running against John Quincy Adams, who's a national Republican. So this is a complete rematch of the last election, minus the other two candidates. And this election is important because now we're going to see this complete democratization of American society. So that means that, although it's not the complete population of the United States, all white men are pretty much able to vote at this point. In 1824, you're going to see more of this, but now there's basically no restrictions on voting having to do with wealth and land ownership. So now a bunch of new average white males in society are going to be showing up, and this is going to benefit Andrew Jackson and the Democrats a lot. Because remember, Andrew Jackson did appeal to the common man. So now that they're coming into the election to vote more, who are they going to vote for? Most likely Andrew Jackson. So this is really helpful for him. And on top of that, another way that either side gets support in this election is this new habit of nasty campaigning and mudslinging. So mudslinging, it sounds really funny when you read it, but it's basically the candidate bashing and slandering the name of the other candidate in order to get support on their own side and to damage the other's campaign. And this was at an all-time high during this election of 1828. So Adams went really hard at Jackson when he was mudslinging and campaigning in this election. So he talked about a lot of the things that he hated about Jackson, such as the fact that he was so involved in the slave trade, he massacred so many Native Americans, and he had a lot of blood on his hands from all the illegal duels he was involved in. He also went as far as to take jabs at Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel Jackson, and even went as far as to take jabs at his family and his mom. So this got really personal on the end of Andrew Jackson. Also, you're going to see Jackson dish it right back to John Quincy Adams, because he's going to talk about some really controversial things, such as how John Adams surrendered an innocent American girl to the Russian Tsar when he was minister to Russia. So we don't know for sure if this is true, but this would be a huge blow to his campaign if it was. And he also talked about how he abused public funds to buy personal gambling items, such as a pool table and a chess set. So it seems so insignificant, but doing these things would add on to this reputation of scandal that would also be born out of the corrupt bargain as well. So this dark cloud of scandal was just hanging over John Quincy Adams' head and was made worse by this nasty mudslinging. So regardless of how both sides did it, Andrew Jackson pulled out this victory with 178 electoral votes. Adams lost with 83 electoral votes, and you can see that the sectionalism in the country is showing through the results of this election. Because if you look at the map, you can see the South loves Andrew Jackson. This could be in part from the tariff of 1828 that Adams passed that made the South angry, or it can be, in the part that Andrew Jackson had influence in the South in Congress. But either way, the South was really a lot of Andrew Jackson supporters, and the North kind of stuck with John Quincy Adams. But the sectionalism is showing, the democratization of American society is showing, and this new age of the common man is dawning. And also, you can really see how much Andrew Jackson appealed to the common man, because after his inauguration, he's going to have over 20,000 people celebrate his inauguration at the White House. And this is going to, cause this big fiasco. And this is going to show, he does appeal to the common man, but things did get a little crazy. After the craziness that was the election of 1828, we're now going to have Andrew Jackson as the 7th president. And he's definitely a fresh, new sort of president. He's very different from the presidents that we've seen in the White House before. And he was really seen as this symbol of new political changes and this new era of the common man that is now, dawning over the United States. He was known as the people's president, and he did things very differently. And an example of this is something called the spoils system. And this was Jackson's way of turning over the way government was. So Jackson essentially was going to turn over old office holders with more loyal, unqualified people. So if people didn't have the qualifications to be in these federal government positions, he didn't care. He felt as though there was corruption in the old federal government, and he wanted to replace those positions with positions of people that he trusted, that were loyal to him, and that he felt weren't corrupt. And this was going to be really controversial and really problematic because this was going to lead to Jackson's kitchen cabinet, which was basically his unofficial cabinet, his advisors. And none of these people were approved by the Senate. None of them were really qualified. So this was going to lead to a lot of these people being not ready for these positions, not qualified, not doing their job as well as they should, not being educated on how to successfully carry out, what these people were supposed to be doing in the government. So this was going to make a lot of people uneasy, but it was going to make a lot of people think, finally the corruption in the federal government was going to be gone. And it's not for no reason, because Andrew Jackson did end up uncovering some corruption in the government and some scandal in the government. But it was still a really bold step for him to take to make this whole spoil system and to overturn up to 20% of the federal jobs that were already given to other people. So this spoil system, this kitchen cabinet, they were really signs that Andrew Jackson was a man of the people. He thought that this was a very democratic thing to do, was to replace these federal positions with fresh new positions on people who were common. Common man should have these important federal jobs. They should be involved in the federal government. So although this was seen as problematic and ridiculous to some, to others this seemed like a more democratic way of doing things. And Andrew Jackson for sure was a man who did things different. So the nullification crisis was a huge deal in so many ways, but first let's talk about where it came from and why it snowballed into this huge deal. So the nullification crisis was based on this issue, and that issue was tariffs. So I know we talked about it before, but tariffs are taxes on imported goods being brought into the United States from other countries. And these tariffs were going to affect the United States in different ways in the North and the South. So in the North, we know that they're more industrial, they have more factories and mills, and their economy actually benefits a lot from these tariffs because you're going to have people in the United States wanting to buy goods in the United States, particularly the North, because they don't want to spend the money to buy from outside of the United States. But this is going to hurt the Southern economy because the Southerners have a more agricultural economy and they really base their economy on buying goods from outside of the United States. So this is going to hurt them a lot. And this is going to make it so parts of their economy are going to be completely diminished as a result of these tariffs. But we know that tariffs are going to infuriate the Southerners, but let's talk about what tariffs infuriated them. So the first tariff was the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations, passed at the end of Adams' presidency. And this was going to hike up tariff prices over 60%, which is even crazy to think about. And this was already going to set forth this idea of nullification, or basically saying that they're not going to listen to this tariff at all. And then when Andrew Jackson becomes president, we're now going to see him pass the Tariff of 1832, which although it's not as severe, this is still going to infuriate the Southerners, particularly South Carolina, and they're going to decide they need to do something about it. And this is where it gets really shady because the man behind the nullification is going to be Andrew Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun. And that's a situation we don't see every day. So John C. Calhoun is basically going to say that they're going to nullify this tariff and say that if the federal government tries to collect the taxes, they're not going to pay it. They're going to say that this is null and void. They're not going to listen to this. And they're even going to go as far to say as if the federal government tries to collect the taxes, South Carolina as a state is going to leave the United States, or we call that seceding. And this is a really hefty thing to say. This is a big deal. And Andrew Jackson, with his fiery personality that we know about, he does not like to be threatened, and he doesn't take this well. And he approaches this with something called the olive branch and the sword. And this is the way he's going to resolve this issue. So when we see olive branch, we think of things like peace. And with that, we're going to see the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which is thought of by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. And this is essentially going to appease both sides and make it so the tariff will lower itself and get lower and lower over the next 10 years. So this is going to keep both sides quiet and eventually solve this issue. But before that happens, you're going to see the sword part of the olive branch and the sword. And that is Andrew Jackson's Force Bill of 1833, saying that they will pay the tax, they will pay the tariff, they will not secede, or else they will see government action from the army of the federal government. And this is eventually going to get South Carolina to back down, and this will lead to the Compromise Tariff of 1833. So although this is a crazy thing to deal with in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and this is something really tough that he has to deal with, this is going to say a lot about what's going to happen in the future. This says a lot about the sectionalism in the United States and how bad it's getting, and this is really going to set the stage for what's going to happen in a few decades, which will be the Civil War. The conflicts between Andrew Jackson and the Native people were going to really define his presidency in many ways. So before we go into how it defined his presidency and defined the United States, let's first talk about how these conflicts started. So this conflict started because white settlers during Jackson's presidency wanted Native American land in Georgia, North Carolina, and Alabama, and Jackson wanted them to have it. But there was one issue with taking this Native American land, and that was the fact that these Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Choctaw people had the right to be there. So what I mean by that was there were treaties that were set in stone between the United States and the Native people saying that they were allowed to be on this land in Georgia, North Carolina, and Alabama. So basically, Andrew Jackson couldn't just forcefully remove them. But all in all, Jackson was just ready to disregard all these treaties and move forward with forcefully removing them anyway. And this would lead to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which would remove these people and put them in present-day Oklahoma territory. So due to the fact that this was just as wrong as it sounded, the Cherokee Indians recognized how unconstitutional this was, and they decided to take this to the Supreme Court of the land. And this would snowball into the court case known as Worcester versus Georgia, where for once and shockingly, American history went on the side of the Native American people when John Marshall sided with the Cherokee Indians and their treaties, saying that the United States had no jurisdiction over these lands that the Native Americans were living on. Therefore, they couldn't remove them. This seems like a huge win for the Cherokee people and all the rest of the Native people on this land, but it really wasn't, because Andrew Jackson did not care at all about the Supreme Court ruling, and he was not willing to enforce it. He even told Marshall that if he wanted to enforce it, he would have to, because Jackson wouldn't at all. So this was a complete loss, and it honestly wasn't even worth the court case because the result didn't matter to Jackson anyway. So this would lead to a lot of conflict. It would lead to the Second Seminole War, and moving forward outside of Andrew Jackson's presidency, the next president, Martin Van Buren, would then be responsible for the Trail of Tears, which would lead all of these people forcefully out of their lands, leading to a mass death of the Native people. So although Andrew Jackson had, this Indian Removal Act of 1830 within his presidency, this would have after effects and ripple effects that would go long after he was out of office. So what a way to ring in Andrew Jackson's second term as president. We are now going to go into the Bank War. So the Bank War erupted in 1832, and of course at the center of this, you're going to see this argument between Henry Clay and President Jackson, and that's going to be the fact that we have to deal with if we want to renew the charter for the Bank of the United States. So we're going to see Nicholas Biddle, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay on the side of the Bank of the United States, or the federal bank, and they are going to propose to Congress a re-charter of the Bank of the United States. So this is going to bring back the federal bank the same way it was during James Monroe's presidency. And this entire thing's going to get through Congress, but Jackson's going to veto it, calling it unconstitutional. But here's where things get tricky, because technically, this is constitutional. If we rewind to McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court did rule that the federal bank is constitutional and that the federal government has the power to make a federal bank. So this is going to add more and more to this King Andrew I idea, that Andrew Jackson is just completely going against what the government says, completely going against checks and balances and the Constitution, and doing really just whatever he wants. So at this point, Andrew Jackson's going to do something really crazy, and he's going to take out federal funds from the federal banks, and he's going to put these funds and disperse them into loyal state banks called pet banks. So banks in the states that were loyal to him. And this is going to cause rapid inflation and increased land grabs in the West. So this is going to start this really slow process towards this explosion of a panic with the economy after his presidency. So this idea is going to appeal to the common man. He's going to appeal to them and say that, federal banks are only for wealthy, elite Americans, so we should all not want to recharter this bank. And people are going to side with him on this. But the federal banks ultimately were important for several different reasons. So by killing the federal bank, this was going to kill the economy. So this ultimately was a bad idea. But it's important to understand that he also had one last hurrah when he tried to fix this, and that was called the Species Circular, which was his idea that he was going to take hard money as the only payment for land. which like silver and gold and things like that. So he thought that this would halt inflation, halt this extreme buying of land that was happening at this point, but it did not. It only made the economy worse, and he essentially left a mess for presidents to come.